When people make decisions about who they sleep with, who they get married to, and how they connect those decisions to having children, they're responding to both sort of lower impulses, quite literally in certain ways, but also to higher impulses as well, to aspirations connected to visions of the good life, of human flourishing that are often bound up in, traditionally have been bound up in religious ideas, are bound up in images of what a happy family is, of what a good father or a good mother is, of what a happy childhood is, and so on. And so I think it isn't enough to imagine a cultural consensus that just makes a utilitarian case. That cultural consensus would have to involve some level of aspirational idealism around images of the two-parent monogamous family, and also some form of stigma around people who deviate from or don't live up to that norm. And both of those are even harder, I think, to imagine our culturally divided culture achieving. And I think I'll sort of finish up there, but just say briefly that I think the examples that Brad cites are sort of telling in this regard of successful campaigns. I think if you look at the campaign around smoking, for instance, that is a campaign that succeeded in sort of with a kind of obviously utilitarian appeal to people's health and well-being, but with a extremely visceral version of a utilitarian appeal. It wasn't just quit smoking and your health metrics will improve at X level in 20 years. It was quit smoking so you don't die, right? And that's a harder argument to make around out-of-wedlock childbearing, because people who start families outside of the success sequence don't die. They have, obviously tragedies happen, but they have children that they love, and they move in and out of relationships, and those relationships have fluctuations and so on. But people are not, there isn't that same kind of stark incentive at work. And the other thing we did with smoking was that we stigmatized smokers. We didn't stigmatize them in a sort of necessarily finger-wagging way, but we stigmatized them by pushing them to the margin of restaurants, businesses, public institutions, and so on, and by sticking them outside and saying, look at those smokers shivering out in the cold. You don't want to be like them, right? And we used to do a version of that around out-of-wedlock childbearing, and I think for very good reasons we moved away from the particularly gendered forms of stigma that were attached to out-of-wedlock childbearing. But if you're going to imagine a future that looks different from the one we have now, you have to imagine some level of stigma that coexists with the aspirations that we're holding up. And, I think the same is true in certain ways around drunk driving. Again, the sort of visceral fear, don't drive drunk or you will die, and we'll show you pictures of tragic accidents that teenagers have been in during our high school lectures on this. And you can do a version of this with teen pregnancy, and this is obviously what, in certain ways, Teen Mom and other shows have done. But again, the visceral quality weakens the older people get, and the more they're in a situation where they feel like maybe they're ready to have kids, and maybe they haven't met Mr. Right, or they have a Mr. Maybe Right who they want to try out while they have a kid with him, or some version of the same thing for men. And you just don't have that sort of visceral "don't do this or you'll die" idea. And then finally, and that sort of connects to teen pregnancy, we have made real strides in combating teen pregnancy, but to drive down the teen pregnancy rate, you are telling people don't have sex very carefully, use contraception very carefully, don't have kids, and so on, in a narrow time window. 4 or 5 years, while most people are still living at home with their parents or trying to get started in college and so on. And nobody at 17 is confronted with the prospect that they're being told, don't have a kid now because you're not at the right place in the success sequence, but maybe you're 5 years away from having your own fertility chances go down. This is one of the issues here, that to get people to sort of get into this success sequence, you're asking them to essentially take risks on their long-term fertility, their long-term likelihoods of having kids and families and so on. And you're asking them to take risks on people who, might not merit that risk. Take a risk on the man you're with right now or the woman you're with right now that you can be married to them and legally bound to them and so on. And none of that is really in play in the arguments that we're pitching to 16-year-olds about how they shouldn't have a kid until they're out of their parents' house.